Good evening, everyone, and welcome to DCPS Parent University. My name is Natalie Treadgold from the DCPS Family Engagement Team, and I'm going to be your host this evening. Tonight, we're going to be talking about experiencing restorative practices with your family, and we're super excited to have some great experts from the DCPS team here to talk with you about restorative practices. Parent University is our goal at DCPS with Parent University is to empower families with the information, the resources, and the connections that you need to be active partners in your child's education. Particularly with the Parent University Reopened strand, which this session tonight is part of, we're focusing on information that families need in order to start this virtual school year strong. We have a couple of great sessions coming up in the next few weeks. On September 15th, we'll have a session about attendance for this current school year. And on the 17th, a session about high school grading, graduation, and attendance supports. You can sign up for those sessions using the link at the bottom of this slide. For those that need subtitles or captions for this event, you can turn on your captions or subtitles using the gear icon in the bottom of your screen and select the language of your preference. As you know, we're using Microsoft Teams for this Parent University. And so to interact with us, you'll be using the question and answer feature of Microsoft Teams. So we are so excited to respond to your questions. We have a team of experts behind the scenes here who will be responding in real time. We won't be able to get to every single question. So if you see a person ask the question that you're also interested in, go ahead and use that thumbs up button so we know that that's a popular question and we'll be sure to answer it. Also, if your question is really unique or specific to your own personal situation, we may answer it privately or give you an email or contact information for someone to follow up with directly. It's really important to us that Parent University is a safe and supportive space for our families. So we have a couple of community agreements that we ask folks to follow when they're in this space. The first is to assume the best intentions. We know that that's especially important, that we assume the best intentions of our families, and also ask that you assume best intentions of our presenters and of each other. The second agreement is that we're going hard on ideas and soft on people. So again, like I said, really protecting the space and making sure that people feel safe. And finally, accept non-closure. So, we have a lot to tackle in this next hour together, and we won't be able to get to every single question or every single topic that you might want to cover. We'll encourage you to follow up afterwards with our Parent University email if there's information that you are still interested in hearing about. And like I said, please feel free to use that Q&A feature and thumbs up those questions that you're most interested in. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our wonderful presenters. We have Anise Walker, who is the Restorative Practices Specialist from the Secondary Schools team. And then we have Danielle Butler-Neale, who's the Restorative Practices Specialist on the elementary school side. They're going to tell you a little bit more about the work that they do, and we're going to start with Anise, who's going to kick it off.
Good evening, everyone. Again, my name is Anise Walker. I'm really excited to speak with you this evening. And we thank you for joining us for this afternoon's presentation on restorative practices with your family. Next slide, please. So here's our agenda for this evening. We're going to start off with a welcome and kind of frame your information this evening with some norms. We're going to go over our restorative practices opener. And we're going to talk a little bit about what are restorative practices, the benefits of restorative practices, and then some strategies that you can learn of support using the restorative practices continuum. Next slide, please. To promote equity, DCPS will provide access, inclusion, and affirmation, offering the most support where the greatest disparities have persisted. Our session today connects to the Equity and Practices quadrant of the DCPS Equity Lens, which is highlighted in red at the bottom of the slide. For more information, please explore the full DCPS Equity Framework by using the bit.ly at the top of this slide. Next slide, please. Also for today's session, we're going to use the Courageous Conversations norms, which includes 4 agreements, 6 conditions, and a compass in order to engage, sustain, and deepen our interracial dialogue about race. So I want to give you a moment to look at the information on the slide and determine which of these agreements, conditions, or portion of the compass that you want to lean into for this evening. All right, next slide, please. So let's go ahead and get started with our restorative practices opener. As a member of the social emotional learning team, we open all of our trainings with a social emotional opener. Today's SEL opener connects to the self-awareness competency of the SEL framework. Given our new normal, virtual learning will highlight different skill sets for parents who are used to in person. So we wear a lot of hats, and we want you to think about, in doing that, if you could be a superhero, what powers would you choose and why? And we want you to think about how this superpower could influence your household. So we want you to take a few minutes to think about it and try to drop that information into our Q&A, and we'll try to respond to some of the things that we see. Once again, if you could be a superhero, what power or powers would you choose and why? And think about how that superpower could influence your household. So I'll try to kick us off. As a single parent, I know that the superpower that I would try or that I would want to incorporate in my house is teleportation, because I want to be able to get to places quickly, considering how the traffic can be here in DC. So I want to be able to teleport to where I'm going so I wouldn't have to worry about driving or traffic. Is there anyone else that would like to share? Okay, well, we'll just keep going. Thank you, though. Next slide, please. So by the end of today's session, you'll be able to gain a basic understanding of restorative practices and also understand how to incorporate restorative practices at home to strengthen your familial and school relationships. So, what are restorative practices? Next slide, please. Restorative practices are social sciences that study how to build social capital and achieve social discipline through mutual learning and decision making. So for you at home, this is a way for you to connect with the members of your family, with members of your school community, or other communities that you may be a part of, like church, the grocery store, or the community center. And what are some of the benefits that we might see from restorative practices? Next slide, please. Some of those benefits could include building and strengthening relationships, providing opportunities to discuss and manage conflicts, repair harm that could be caused between members of your family, like teasing, disrespect, or not following directions, and even help to restore relationships that might be fractured in your household, in school, or in other places where you engage with other people, especially since our interactions now are much different given our new normal. Next slide, please. So we say all that to say that the overall benefit of using restorative practices at home is to strengthen connections with others, create a positive and productive learning environment at home and in school, increase social emotional learning skills and cultural awareness, and develop skills to resolve conflicts and problem solve. So, and to connect these benefits to what's happening in some of our schools, here are a few examples of schools that are focusing on building these skills, like Martin Luther King Jr. Elementary School, Eaton Elementary School, and Neville Thomas Elementary School, Hart Middle School, Ida B. Wiles Middle School, and Columbia Heights Education Campus, and Ballou High School, H.D. Woodson High School, and Wilson High School. So now I'm going to turn the presentation over to my colleague, Danielle, who will wrap up this section of the presentation and share specific strategies that you can use after our presentation. It's all yours, Danielle.
Thank you, Anise. Good afternoon again, everyone. My name is Danielle Butler-Neale, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm the restorative practice specialist for elementary schools, and I too am on the SEL and school culture team with DCPS. I'm excited to share some additional information with you about how to use restorative practices with your family. We're going to take a look at a short video that will talk about how to think restoratively when you engage in family conversations.
I just came on here real quick just to remind you guys, hey man, while we're in this crazy time, I know a lot of people and a lot of things are kind of getting on your nerves. I know your little brother is getting on your nerves, your sister is getting on your nerves, your cousins, your aunties, uncles, and sometimes your parents, but let's pause. You're getting on their nerves too, so let's just be clear. But I want you to do, in spite of whatever it is you're going through, I need you guys to remember to think restoratively. Yes, you heard Mr. Caldwell say you got to think restoratively. And in thinking restoratively, you got to think about how do you deal with conflict when you're dealing with issues with family members, when you're dealing with issues with friends, when you're dealing with issues on social media, your social media interaction. Yeah, I see you. I need you to really think restoratively. You got to ask yourself just three things. First thing is what I'm doing making me better or the other person better? Then the next thing you got to ask yourself, how will my reaction impact the individual? And last but not least, how can I fix this conflict so things can be better and be cool? Because you got to understand, it's not about how people treat you, but it's based upon how you respond. That is what life is all about, man. I need you guys to think restoratively always, every day. Man, put this thing to practice. I don't want you to forget that you have a job to do, just like we got a job to do. Man, I love y'all. I miss y'all. I'm so excited about what's going to happen next school year. Yeah, I'll see you guys then, man. Y'all be good. Peace.
So now that you've had the opportunity to see and hear how to think restoratively at home, I want you to now connect what you saw to a few questions that will guide our conversation and enable you to reflect individually over the next few minutes. So I'm just going to reiterate the questions so you can formulate your thinking. So the first question is, are my actions making me a better person? Are my actions making someone else a better person? How would my reaction impact the other individual? How can I fix the conflict or situation? So now I would like for you to take about a minute to just reflect on these questions and place your answers in the Q&A portion of the chat and think about how you can act and think restoratively with your family. I see some answers that are populating. Some are small impromptu conversations, circles. Yes, all of those are good answers. So I don't expect for everybody to think of everything right here and now, but what I would like to do is continue to formulate those thoughts as we are going through the presentation. And if something stands out for you, please feel free to place it in our Q&A portion. Next slide. So the next portion of our agenda will explore strategies of support using the Restorative Practices Continuum, which are a range of strategies that will support how we can interact with one another and build a stronger sense of empathy, understanding, and community. So let's talk about it. Now that you've heard a few things regarding restorative practices so far, you may be asking yourself, how do we get there as a family? Or how do we start this new way of engagement? When it comes down to building relationships and forming deeper connections using restorative practices, it will require a new way of thinking, or what we call a mindset shift. Taking intentional or dedicated time to just be self-aware about what you're feeling, what the other person is feeling, and how we want to continuously improve our communication styles with one another will birth new practices. New practices, or how you interact with others, will begin to happen organically because you already know how to frame your thinking about the situation, which in return will generate a different response. In most cases, when something negative happens, we're quick to rush to judgment or give an immediate punitive response without hearing the other person's side. But that doesn't mean that a consequence isn't warranted. It just means when we act restoratively, we give the other person the space to express their feelings, think about the impact of their behavior, and how the behavior can be improved moving forward. Then after all of this occurs, new results will show, and they will be embedded more in your routine of engaging in healthy conversations moving forward. Next slide. This slide here represents the restorative practices continuum, which are a range of informal to formal strategies that communicate how a person is feeling and provide time for reflection on how their behavior has impacted others. Although all of these supports are useful, as you can see, when building and maintaining relationships on an ongoing and consistent basis, you will use some of these from time to time. But this evening, we're going to focus on the 3 informal supports that will foster active listening, empathy and understanding, and a place for a small conversation. Those supports are affective statements, affective questions, and small impromptu conferences. Next slide, please. So, what are affective statements? Affective statements are simply just I statements that provide a person the opportunity to express their feelings in the moment about a particular situation or issue. It is through affective statements that a person is afforded the opportunity to change the dynamics of what could have been a negative situation into a positive outcome. These statements set clear boundaries, welcome empathy and understanding, as well as provide a perspective as to where the person is coming from. They personalize your approach so that there aren't any misunderstandings on how they feel in the moment. Affective statements can always be used to provide feedback or as well acknowledge success, hard work, or collaboration. These statements give people a new perception of you rather than just an authoritative figure or just, for children, just a child. Next slide, please. This slide just highlights some of the examples of typical statements versus affective statements. A statement like, "Good job today, Justin," is deemed a typical statement versus, "Justin, I was really happy that you cleaned up your room without asking." That could be identified as an affective statement. Now, hearing and seeing these statements on the screen, I want you to kind of tell me, what do you notice about the differences in these 2 sets of statements? I'll give you about 2 minutes to look at the typical and affective statements and share your thoughts in the chat so that I can highlight some of your comments in our discussion. I'm going to take a look at some of our portions in the chat just to see if something's popping up. Yes, someone said, "I can ask my kids, how can I help, instead of telling them what to do." That's a really good way to be supportive restoratively. Someone else said, "Listen, that's a good idea." Thank you for lifting that up. Consider the outcome I want before acting or reacting. Yes, that's a good way of supporting your students as well. I actually like that answer. Affective statements are more specific. Yes, they are very specific. So yes, all of these answers that you all are giving are very good indicators that you clearly understand that typical statements just pretty much tell, but affective statements are pretty much highlighting how you are feeling in the moment about what has happened. So those are really good comments. Thank you for that. Next slide, please. So now that we understand what affective statements are, we can now talk about how affective questions can help guide a healthy conversation. Affective questions can help someone process an incident or conflict. When something happens, the wrongdoer is able to answer questions that will focus on the incident, take responsibility for their actions, and consider the impact that they have had on others. On the other hand, affective statements are also answered by those who have been impacted by the incident. It helps them to process their feelings and determine what they may need to make the issue right. They are also framed to identify boundaries while eliminating biases and judgment. On the next slide, we're going to talk about how and see some examples of affective statements, affective questions, that will help you facilitate or gauge in future discussions. Next slide, please. So here are some examples of affective questions that can be used when you're dealing with challenging behavior and to help those who were affected. Questions like what happened and what did you think when you realized what happened will begin to birth a healthy exchange of conversation. The questions will set the stage for the facilitator, which may be yourself or someone else, the opportunity to allow the wrongdoer and the victim both time to share their thoughts without casting blame and infuse into the conversation additional questions that will foster understanding, reflection, and making things right. So now I want you to just take a minute to think about what do you notice about the differences in these two sets of questions? Feel free to share your comments in the Q&A portion of our chat, and I will try to capture them again as we go along. You notice any difference? I see something coming in. Someone says it allows you to connect directly with your family and speak about the impact of their actions. Absolutely. So again, as we are still going through the presentation, again, if something just sticks out to you or something that you would like to share with us, again, just please drop some of that information into the Q&A, and again, I will try to capture as soon as possible. Next slide, please. So now that we've talked about and discussed affective statements and affective questions, we can now tie those two pieces together when we have what we call small impromptu conferences. So you may ask, what is a small impromptu conference? A small impromptu conference is a small conversation that is commonly used to address an issue right away. For example, if you get a call from your child's teacher regarding their behavior, you may want to address that issue right away after you get off the phone, or if there's a sibling rivalry going on, you may want to address that issue too right away before it escalates. But using those affective questions will help guide the conversation and provide clear understanding and a workable solution. Next slide. So in closing, I just want to emphasize that restorative practices at home will provide opportunities for engagement for you as parents, your children, siblings, neighbors, community members, and school staff in a way that would allow people to relate to one another, honor their individualities, and the communities that they represent. But last but not least, restorative practices will nurture, guide, and support any opportunity for shared reflection and learning. Next slide, please. So now that we've just covered some, but not all of the elements of restorative practices for you and your families to use, I just want to give you some time now to place any questions that you may have into the Q&A, and Natalie is going to help me with those questions that are posed.
Great, thanks, Danielle. I'm going to go ahead and get us started with a couple of questions while folks are putting things into the Q&A. So the first one is, could you talk us through what the approach might be if a parent, we're all really stressed right now. If a parent loses their temper with their child and they raise their voice or spoke in a way that wasn't modeling good behavior, what's the approach that you would recommend they take to try and use restorative practices to mend that relationship? And okay.
Well, one of the things that I would suggest is that, and thanks Anise is also too on to help answer questions. One of the things that I would suggest is to the parent just have a small impromptu conference with the child, acknowledging that they may have used a tone or operated in a way that they did not feel was satisfactory. First, having that acknowledgement eases the tension for the child, because we're on a playing field of having a conversation and wanting to get to the root cause of the issue in the first place is going to be the ultimate goal. So just having that acknowledgement piece of talking about what they did wrong, using those guided questions, and it may be the child at this point using the affective questions to kind of guide and talk with their parents around how they're feeling and how it has impacted them, and then working together to have that workable solution on how to make it right.
And I would piggyback that idea with, I use restorative practices with my own daughter at home. And there's been some times where, stressful at work or, caught in traffic and things like that. So like Danielle said, the actual acknowledgement of, I realized that I said something to you that, could have hurt your feelings or could have made you feel bad. And I apologize for that, because I realize that I don't want us to have that kind of a conversation or that kind of interaction. And then go to talk about, this is why I was the way that I was, and how are you feeling about that? So we could try to remedy that right away, as opposed to kind of let it sit and fester. And then my daughter stays mad and I stay mad, and then we just really don't address it.
Great, thank you guys so much for sharing. I think that's some really helpful guidance. Another question is, if you mentioned, Anise, at the beginning, a list of schools that are really digging into restorative practices. If a DCPS parent knows that their child has had a conflict with another student, what's kind of their correct action steps to have the school address that conflict using restorative practices?
What we could do is we could have you tap into the dean of students, behavior tech, ISS coordinator, or someone on the leadership team in that building. And if there is no one in that building that is trained on how to use restorative practices, myself or Danielle, depending upon the grade level, would come out and try to support that, that staff member in kind of trying to work through that issue.
And just to add to that piece, we do know that school communities can be very close in relationships. They can be very, so we want to eliminate bias and judgment around the issue. So sometimes it is warranted to have an outside facilitator support that restorative practice conversation. That way that person is able to gain an understanding of what has occurred, and that's the pre-work that has to be done prior to that engagement. So that way when the formal conversation is had, which is more a formalized approach, the outcome can be more equitable because this person is helping to facilitate that dialogue with an open lens.
Great, that's really helpful. Another question is, so how are you all thinking about restorative practices and your work in general shifting with learning at home? How are you supporting schools to work through virtual instruction and continue to provide supports, social emotional learning supports to their students and families?
We are aiming to become a restorative district. And in doing such, Anise and I spend a lot of dedicated time working with our deans, our in-school suspension coordinators, principals, and also other supporting school staff on how to utilize restorative practices in a way that they will be able to best support their students. Because we do not see the students on a day-to-day basis, many of them do. So a lot of those issues will arise firsthand at the school level. So we want to make sure that our school-based teams are heavily supported with the foundational structures of restorative practices, how to utilize the different elements of the continuum, so that way when a situation arises, they're able to know which strategy to best use to get the support that the students need. That we know that the pandemic is not easy. We know that virtual learning is something new for our students, and we want them to still be successful. So it is through restorative practices that we want to 80% proactively engage with them, let them know that they are cared for, let them know that they are heard and appreciated by engaging in those morning circles and those frequent check-ins just to see how they're doing. So that way, if something does happen on the responsive side, which is 20% of restorative practice engagement, it's going to be an easy and smooth transition.
Great. So I think that's all the questions that we have. Thank you guys both for, or you ladies, both for sharing your expertise. I know that there's so much really practical information that was shared throughout the presentation, and I know that I can definitely use some of those tips with my own family here. We're stuck in this little apartment together all the time. So I'm going to go ahead and move us to the conclusion. But want to highlight the contact information here. So if families, if you do have additional questions and you weren't able to raise them this evening, please don't hesitate to reach out to Danielle, to Anise, or to Justin, who has been on the back end this evening helping to answer questions in the Q&A. I'll leave this up for a minute, but also we will be sharing the recording of the presentation and the deck, and I'm about to let you know where you can find that information. So again, Anise, Danielle, also to Justin and Dr. William Blake, who are all on here. Thank you so much for sharing this evening. This has been a really wonderful and helpful last 45 minutes. So
you're welcome.
moving into a few, moving into a few housekeeping items. So like I said at the beginning, we have a few upcoming Parent University sessions that we'd love for you to join on the September 15th attendance and September 17th high school grading, graduation, and supports. you'll see in the chat the link where you can sign up to RSVP, and we'd love to see you at both or one of those sessions. Like I mentioned, we will be posting the recordings on YouTube, so you can access them on the bit.ly here on the screen. And then also that will be posted in the chat as well. Just a final few things. So for additional resources about learning at home and the start to the school year, you can visit dcpsreopenstrong.com. The recordings are also linked there, as well as the PowerPoint deck from the presentation. We'd love for you to fill out a feedback form to let us know how this workshop was for you, and let us know how we can continue to improve and provide more helpful information for you as a DCPS parent. And finally, the parentu@k12.dc.gov email address for any questions, suggestions, ideas that you have. Feel free to reach out, and we try to get back to folks within 24 hours or so. So that's it from us. Go enjoy the rest of your evening, and thank you again for joining us for Parent University.